Hey, what's going on, YouTube? This is Acadius, and here is yet another unexpected, unplanned video. I really didn't expect to see this. According to him, he's done 15 years. He's played for 15 years. He knows better than everyone else. Okay, well, I played World of Warcraft before you ever did, and I'm telling you right now, I don't think you freaking know what in the world you're talking about, bro. You need a freaking reality check, and I'm about to give it to you. So let's get to it.
So, what?
The reason why I think tanks are unpopular and people don't play them is because, like, in Classic WoW, it's not fun to play a tank. That's the main reason. It's got nothing to do with anything else. It's just simply not fun to play a tank because you don't do any damage, you can't do anything. Oftentimes, your effectiveness is tied to other players, and you have more responsibility.
What other roles are there
and you can't solo either.
Besides the tank?
Okay, right off the bat, that is some dumb shit. Like, I can't believe you're saying it wasn't fun to play a tank in Classic WoW. What are you talking about? We freaking struggled back then. It was so much fun working together to try and figure out how to take down bosses that, like back then there was no guides. By the time your freaking little punk ass got into the game, there was guides everywhere. And you just read the guide and it just told you how to do it. We didn't have that freaking option, asshole. We had to sit there and figure it out. We had to go through our combat logs. All the freaking officers in the guild, the class captains in the guild, would have our combat logs up, and we'd be freaking going through them after every time we died, trying to figure out where things went wrong. And then we have to come back with a better plan, trying to freaking alleviate the problem. And that's how we finally figured out how to beat each boss. So you always make this stupid ass bullshit comment like, "Oh, it's so easy, classic WoW." Okay, yeah, sure. From, looking back with hindsight being 2020, I'm sure it's super fucking easy. But it wasn't easy at the time when we didn't have any guides. At best, we had word of mouth from another guild on the server that has already done that boss or that raid. And then we'd have to talk to them if they were willing to share that information, which a lot of guilds that were on the top of the server, they didn't want to share that information. They didn't want people catching up to them. They wanted to stay at number one. So they didn't tell us. They weren't just freely telling us. Sometimes we had to pay them money in order for, gold, not real money. There was no real money at the time yet. That came later, for them to freaking tell us how to fight this boss so that we could continue in the raid. That those days are long gone. Obviously, now the internet has blown up like crazy. Everybody's got guides all over the place. You can just sit there and watch a YouTube video. Oh yeah, that's how to do it. Uh-huh. Okay, we didn't have that crap back then. So I think you need to take your freaking mind out of what you know and then put it back into before you came into World of Warcraft and what were things like then and how did people do things back then, so that before you can ever make some kind of comment about playing in classic WoW days. Modern Classic WoW was not original Classic WoW days. And back then, I can tell you right now, because I was a tank, I was a main tank for a large raiding guild, it was freaking fun to play a tank, dude. It was fun. Like, figuring out, like, I was able to do things that other classes couldn't, as a geared up tank. And they would be, like, scratching their heads, like, how are you killing this elite that out levels you? And I'm like, well, I have to blow every cooldown I've got, but I pretty much tank them to death. Because I absorbed so much damage. That was fun. Fighting freaking Ragnaros for the first time. Now building my gear up so that I could fight Ragnaros with my flame resistant gear that I had to craft from BRD. That process wasn't fun. But once we finally got to fighting Ragnaros, that was pretty freaking fun, man. It's a pretty fun fight back then for us. So I don't know why you're saying this. Remember the very thing you say all the time to people. You're one. You're just one. Okay? You don't have any kind of freaking background to make a statement like this when you didn't play Classic WoW back when it was freaking new. You came in way later. So, and you can't solo? What are you talking about? I soloed all the way to max level as a tank. And then I continued to be a tank because I didn't want to pay the respec fees. So I was a tank in PvP. I was a tank running around in the world, and I would tank people to death. Rogues were especially hilarious because they would try to attack me as a geared up tank, and they couldn't even hurt me. So, yeah, it was fun to solo as a tank, and you could solo. Yes, you could, because I did it. Let's continue.
For that, we'll look at the Holy Trinity. A concept, not that Holy Trinity. This one is a staple of most MMORPGs. It breaks down into 3 general roles. DPS, whose focus is dealing damage per second, the healers, who keep everyone alive,
Naturally.
and the tanks, who soak up damage from enemies. Today, the Holy Trinity remains common and is used in titles like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV.
It always worries me whenever I see a game that doesn't use that Holy Trinity system because I just assume it's going to be bad.
So, what does playing a tank actually entail? For this, we'll go to Wikipedia. Tank characters deliberately attract enemy attention and attacks, potentially by using in-game mechanics that force them to be targeted to act as a decoy for teammates. Since this requires them to endure concentrated enemy attacks, they typically rely on a high health pool or support by friendly healers to survive while sacrificing their own damage output. Basically, your job is to attract the attention of enemies and make sure that your teammates don't get caught in the line of fire. Because it's up to you to decide how many monsters you pull and where they'll be positioned, you, by default, also dictate the pace of the raid. Go too fast, healing and damage output won't be enough to keep you alive, and you're going to die. Go too slow, your party is going to get frustrated and move at a snail's pace. Go at just the right speed, and no one will acknowledge that you did anything at all. Plus,
I feel like tanking is usually a job that gets some level of acknowledgement. I personally think that the job that is the most hated is healers. I think that healers have the worst job because as a healer, the difficulty of the game is completely determined by the other people in your party. Like basically, whenever you're healing, you have 4 Mythic Plus affixes in every single dungeon because those are the other 4 people you're playing with.
if those 2 things weren't enough pressure already.
Now, here, I would point out that this dude who he's reacting to his video, he's doing a good job of kind of pointing out like all the different kind of skills you have to have as a tank. You know, especially if you're a main tank. Off tanks is not so bad, but you know, as long as your main tank is up in most fights, then you're good to go. There's some fights that do require more than one tank. But you know, you need to know how to position the boss. You need to know how to pull the boss. Some of the bosses, you need to get them into a specific position, but they're really big. And then you have to figure, well, okay, you're at the head of the dragon, but the dragon swivels in the center of its body is the center point. And you need to get that center point in a particular spot. But then you have to turn them. So that you have to pull the boss and then drag them to where the center point is in the right spot. Then go like a quarter moon around, circle around a quarter moon, you know, in order to turn the boss to get him in the correct position. And then the whole time your raid needs to be backed off. And you need to do this as quickly as possible. You can't fuck it up and be like, well, a little bit over here. You know, it takes too long to move around. You're taking damage. The healers are using their mana. So you got to get it right off the bat. And you know what that is? That's fucking skill, bro. It's skill. That's what that's called, skill and knowledge. Game knowledge is skill in the game. And so is mechanical skill. So tanks take a lot of fucking skill, you know? Now, as far as the most hated class, I don't think tank is the most hated class. I really agree that healers are the most hated class, but not for the reasons that he's listing here. I think it's mostly because most people think it's boring standing there, just healing at range, and then that's all you're really doing, you know, for the most part. You're not mixing it up. You're not getting into the combat. You know, you're not actively dealing damage. Something about dealing damage makes you feel more like you're fighting a boss than just standing in a corner spamming your flash heal or whatever. You know, so I think that's why healers, they're not, I wouldn't say they're hated. It's just people don't like to play healers, man, because it's not as fun for most people. Because most people don't have a support class kind of personality to begin with. You know, that's probably your most pacifist people in the world are going to gravitate more towards healers than anything.
Already, the success of a raid hinges purely on the tank. If a DPS or a healer dies, you can sometimes get away with it. But almost always, if a tank dies, the run is over. For this reason, good tanks are hard to come by. And unless you're a streamer running mythic content with a team of trained professionals, most tanks you meet in matchmaking are not going to be perfect.
Like, and you run still. Somebody's standing behind the thing, you're like, nah, I'm going here. Come on!
Let's look at an
It's
example.
also that the tanks usually, the problem is the tank has to have the highest level of knowledge about the fight usually. Like for
Oh, okay. So the tanks have to have the highest level of knowledge about the fight. Huh. Sounds like skill. The highest level of skill in the fight. And once you honestly, other than weird mechanics that they put into some fights, right? Once you get the basics of tanking down, you get your freaking rotations down where, okay, if I'm doing a single target, these are my rotations. If I'm doing multiple targets, then this is how I do that. And if the situation is extremely dire, then this is what I can do. Like you need to know what to do in each situation if something goes wrong and you need to pick up a second ad that you didn't plan for that somebody else should have been, taking and things are going south, well, okay, well, you got to pick up that second freaking ad and you need to get some thread on it so that it doesn't leave you again. And you need to know which one you need to be targeting the most because that's what they're putting all their damage into to kill it first. You need to know how to do this stuff. Guess what? That's freaking skill. That takes skill. Long term acquired knowledge and skill. So it sounds like what you're trying to say is the tanks need the most skill, right? That's really what you're saying. Okay.
example, on Blackhand there, the tank had to know like where the positioning for the boss needed to be, how to avoid the fire, how to make sure that the boss was away from the tank that was going to spawn in phase 2. They had to be facing the boss towards the balconies that you had to knock players up to and kill. Like, it was very complex. So I think tanking at a base level is probably about as hard as DPS.
What the fuck are you smoking? Did you just hear all the bullshit you just listed off that tanks have to know in order to properly tank that fight? Now, what does the DPS have to worry about? Again? Oh, well, is it time for me to hit my damage buttons yet? Oh, it is? Cool. Well, I'll walk up to the boss now and then I'll hit my damage buttons. Like, what are you smoking, dude? How much meth did you shove up your nose before you freaking did this video? By the look on your face right now, a lot. A lot. Because you constantly listing off all the reasons tanks need tons of skill, a lot more than everyone else. What are the freaking healers? The healers need more skill than the freaking rogues, than the damage. Like what do hunters do? Just sit back and spam the same freaking arrow button over and over. Mages, they're damage, they're damage. You're just saying damage here. You're not even separating it between classes. I would say rogues, for most fights in a standard fight, would need more skill than freaking mages. Mages sit there and hit their fireball button. They could put a water bird on their keyboard and then walk away. And the water bird is just poking their freaking fireball button. And nobody would know any different. Nobody know any different. Every now and then walk up and hit your fire blast. I'm good. Yeah, I'm doing my damage, guys. They're freaking half asleep at the keyboard with the damn water bird. So, like, I can't believe you listed all of the shit that a tank would need to know how to do for that one fight. And then you're like, yeah, it's about as hard as damage, guys. Not to mention everything else that's going on that has to do with tanking, like looking for a hole in the healing where that's going to kill you, that you need to plug with a freaking healing potion. Making sure you're in the right position. Making sure the boss is in the right position. You know what I mean? Like, this is absurd that you would freaking say this. And then also, just like rogues, guess what? That's a baseline. Worrying about your rotations. That's your baseline. Your rogues have to have rotations. Your freaking damage dealers have to have their rotations, and they have to be doing them in the proper order. And so do the tank, so that they can keep their threat up. Or else, well, the boss is going to get pulled. And they have to be doing this while they're also moving their character in order to pull the boss to get them in the right position so that they can then stop worrying about moving. And the whole time they got to be doing this, keeping their threat up while they're getting that boss into the proper position. You know, what do the freaking rogues do? Nothing. They move forward, keep damaging, move forward with the boss, keep damaging, just hit the W, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, some crap. You know, like, come on, man. It's not the same. It's not the same. The amount of shit that's piled up on a tank's plate is way freaking higher than a damage dealer's pile of shit that they need to worry about. Okay, tanks have way more on their plate. And then if a freaking tank dies, it's over. One mistake and it's over. A rogue freaking dies. Meh. We might res you. Who knows? You know, somebody flip a coin. We'll figure out if we're going to res this guy. Who cares? You know, assuming they even die from their mistake. Tank makes a mistake, they're dead. You know, the raid wipes. This is ridiculous.
But the problem is that whenever a DPS makes a mistake, it doesn't matter that much. But whenever a tank makes a mistake, it's usually a wipe.
Example from World of Warcraft. Brood Keep.
Yeah, so whenever, like I said, whenever a tank dies, it's a wipe. And what you're basically saying here is that the quarterback of a football team has the same or needs the same degree of skill as a running back. You know, like how in what universe does the quarterback not need to be the most skilled person on the team? You know, there's a reason why the quarterbacks are looked at and blamed whenever a team loses a ball game. Okay? Main tanks are quarterbacks of the raid. And if they go down, it's over. So they cannot make a mistake for the entire length of that fight. They cannot make a mistake. It's not always the healing's fault. Sometimes there's going to be holes in between heals. Sometimes you're going to have really bad RNG with hits and misses, you know, with your percentages. And then, okay, you need to know that's happening and you need to use a healing potion or last stand or something. Okay, you need to use something to save your ass so that until those healings can come in.
Keeper Diurna. While the fight is fairly straightforward once you understand the mechanics, it's filled with potential run-enders if the tank isn't ready.
That's
First,
right.
the party has to destroy a bunch of eggs before they hatch. While this is pretty easy, you also have to stay at least 50 yards away from the boss to avoid taking unnecessary damage, so the tank has to know what path to take to be efficient. You also have to be aware of
also the tank has to be aware of where the ads are going to spawn too.
Powerful tank debuff that is a potential run-ender. All the while, you're communicating with your team to make sure they're focusing on the right things and drawing aggro from enemies.
Right.
For less experienced players who haven't practiced the most efficient routes, the fight can be frustrating and difficult.
And this is even more true with Mythic Plus. Like, I would not want to do Mythic Plus dungeons because I don't really know what I'm doing as a tank. And there's like so much.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you could admit that you have no idea what the hell you're doing as a tank. And so far, it's shown in spades.
Min-maxing of Mythic Plus dungeons that if you're not doing it exactly the right way, then people get really mad at you.
Plus, if we go back to the last part of the Wikipedia definition, it's clear that a tank's success isn't just up to them. They typically rely on a high health pool or support by friendly healers.
This is why I'm playing DPS in hardcore, because I don't trust anybody
To survive.
That's why.
Although tanks might look like this, they're not invincible. They can only soak up so much damage before they need to be healed, which means if you don't have a good healer, you're going to die. And because you're the tank, you're going to take most of the blame. Which brings us to the social element of being a tank. For the most part, unless you're playing with friends, being a tank sucks. On top of having to tank enemies, players often find themselves tanking criticism and mean words from their fellow party members. Steven Messner, a former writer for PC Gamer, put it best when he described his own experience as a tank in World of Warcraft. This is the first time I've run the dungeon on Mythic difficulty, a nightmarish gauntlet where Blizzard throws all of its cruelest ideas at players in exchange for awesome loot.
But Mythic Dungeon isn't the same thing.
Every tip from the countless guides I've read couldn't have prepared me for the monsters inside. It's not the bloodthirsty, Viking-like Vrykul, but the player that's berating because I am a piece of tank and cancer.
No! Don't f***ing laugh!
Oh, I want to punch in your
Messner's experiences
Which, to be fair, like, there are a lot of tanks, and I don't want to make this turn into like some kind of tank support group, okay? I don't want tanks to watch this video and think to themselves, oh, it's so hard to be me, I work so hard, and, you know, like, I deserve to be taken seriously. Guys. There's a lot of tanks that get shit because they're fucking garbage. They actually suck. They don't know anything about the fucking game.
I definitely agree here. You know, I have found that a lot of people were surprised whenever I got into their group, and they're like, "Oh man, you're like the best tank. Everybody freaking keeps wiping on this dungeon." You know, and I'm like, dude, it's an easy dungeon. You know, because I ran that dungeon a lot with my guild, so I already knew how to do the dungeon. You know, there's a lot of new tanks that, hey, they want to cut their teeth on tanking. Let's switch specs and then just jump in the dungeon finder. You know what I mean? Like, they'll be a two-handed warrior and they'll think like this moron right here thinks, oh, tanking is the easiest job in the game. I got this. I really need this sword. It's from this dungeon, but I can't get a group because I'm damaged. You know what I'll do? I'll switch specs and then I can queue as a tank. And then I can get that sword a lot easier. And I don't have to wait in the freaking timer. And then they do it, and they don't know what the hell they're doing. And then they get freaking stomped. You know, like, oh, I can tank with my two-hander. No, you can't. You need a shield bro. You need to be a shield bro with a shield. Okay? You can't do that. So, yeah, there are a lot of freaking bad tanks, you know, out there. There's a lot of morons out there. And then they think they can tank when they've never done it before. And that's not going to work. You need knowledge. You need skill, and you need to develop it to where it's just automatic. You know, it's automatic. These are just the things we do as tanks. We always do these things whenever we're tanking. You know, I tried playing Final Fantasy. It's not really my game, but I tried playing Final Fantasy when they did this, what was it? This free trial thing. I could go all the way to, I think it was like level 20 or 30. I think it was 30. You know, and so I tried playing, and of course I had to go into some dungeons. I'm trying to figure out what do these abilities do. I kind of had like a rough estimate of what my abilities did just from reading them. I didn't really get into it like really hard. Who cared? You know, anyways, so I go into the dungeons, and then I went as a tank, and I just did what I normally had done for, you know, a decade or more in World of Warcraft. I just did the same things, just with different abilities in a different game. And these other guys were like, dude, how long have you been playing this game? Is this your, like, you know, third character or whatever that you're building up? I'm like, no, I just now started, and they couldn't believe it. And I'm like, you know, I told them, yeah, I played World of Warcraft for, I don't know, all the way from original release to Cataclysm. I quit in Cataclysm because I wasn't about to stomach that crap. No, I was done. It was done. So I quit in Cataclysm, and up until that point, I was a main tank for huge raiding guild and Burning Blade and Mugthal. So I main tanked every boss there was to main tank up until Cataclysm. So yeah, you know, certain things become ingrained, and then you just do them naturally, and it translates as long as you're dealing with a Holy Trinity game. You know, then it's going to translate to that other game. You just need to know which abilities do the most threat, which ones are best for single targets, which ones are best for multiple targets, and then you go from there. You know, and it was pretty easy to understand in Final Fantasy. So, but I completely agree. There's a crap ton of freaking bad tanks, and you know what? There's a crap ton of bad healers too, and bad DPS. So, what are we really talking about here? No matter which way you go, there's a lot of bad players out there, and you're bound to run into them because bad players don't really last very long in big guilds that go anywhere because they get identified and kicked, you know, because they're bad. And you'll start figuring that out the longer you play with them, and eventually you just get rid of them. You know, like freaking Don Yoko and the damn red beam. Motherfucker died to every damn red beam that ever happened. Anyways, let's keep going.
They click their abilities, they backpedal, they can't hold aggro, they don't know the dungeon, they're using leather armor, and they're supposed to be using plate, and they're...
Okay, now, that's a little bit far. If they're using leather armor, What are you doing running the dungeon with them? That's not their lack of skill as much as it's your lack of freaking paying attention and kicking them out. That's your bad decision, okay? You got bad decisions yourself, and you're trying to put that onto them. Obviously, they're dumb. I'm not saying they're not. They are dumb. But you're also dumb. You're equally dumb because you didn't boot them immediately. There's no way that I'm about to run a dungeon and I walk up to my tank and I see leather on that dude and I don't either kick them or leave myself. You know, one of the two. One of the two's happening because what's not happening is I'm not running this dungeon with you. That's not happening. Sorry. Bye. You know, if you don't have a shield on, it's not happening. You're not a tank if you don't have a shield on, you're not a tank. That's just how it is. Sorry.
They're fucking garbage. And you know what? You can tell whenever something like that happens because it will ruin your entire fucking day. It is so bad. Not using a shield. Yeah, there you go.
Not unique.
Yeah, who ruined whose day? That dude's just queuing up. You're the one that decided to run it with him. So maybe next time, stop pointing your fingers at the moron, the obvious moron, that you can inspect their gear and see they're wearing leather, and start pointing it at yourself for having ran the instance with them anyways. That's your fault that you made the decision to do, and that's it. You're at fault for your day being wasted. You did it to yourself. Okay?
And he goes on to say, quote, as much as
I
verbally
would say most tanks suck.
harassing strangers on the internet is tasteless, I also can't help but sympathize when a player gets angry at me.
Yeah, because it's
After
probably
all,
your fault.
my failures are actively wasting their time,
That's right.
and no one wants to spend 40 minutes clearing a dungeon
Yeah.
that should take 20. This kind of toxicity is rampant in matchmaking.
I also think that tanking is it's a much easier role to do in terms of like expectations. So tanking is very binary, where like if you're holding aggro and you're not dying, you're a good tank. It's only until like you get into like Mythic 20 plus that people care about a tank's DPS. And realistically,
Yeah, he's not entirely wrong here. Yeah, if you're holding aggro and you're not dying, then nobody has any problems. But I would say if that's a good tank, then when things go wrong and you know exactly what to do and you freaking jump in, intervene, take some hits from these guys, pick up those extra ads and start man tanking everything in order to protect your party and then you recover, you're a god tank. And that is the difference. You know, that's how, when things go wrong, that's when you know whether you got a great healer and a great tank or if you just got mediocre. Because when things go wrong, those dudes are going to hold everything together. They're going to hold the line and they're going to keep people on task, you know, and say, hey, damage these guys. Here, throw up some targets on people's heads if you have to. Kill this guy first or AoE them down. Just kill them all at the same time, you know, and just depend on that tank to know what he's doing in order to hold AoE aggro on all these 10 or 15 guys that you didn't plan on freaking fighting. You know, these are the moments that separate the top echelon players from the freaking rest of the riffraff. You know, everyone else, as they say.
nobody is going to criticize you on your DPS as a tank as long as you're staying alive and you're holding aggro. Whereas as a DPS, you are always criticized on your DPS in relation to other people. So I actually think that tanking is probably the easiest role in a lot of ways. Like if you
You can't be serious. You're sitting here saying, well, because they get criticized, that means that DPS is more difficult. That doesn't even apply. What are you talking about? More difficult for you as a person to handle criticism? Like, how are you going to handle this video if you even watch it? Probably not so well, considering you think it's extremely difficult, which I have no idea how, considering how long you've been on YouTube and all the ridiculous stuff that people have said about you. That's absurd. Okay? It doesn't translate to actual in-game skill and the requirement of it when people criticize you on your DPS meter. I'm sorry, that's not the same thing. Okay? What you're talking about is difficult to handle criticism as a person because you're the person that's getting criticized. But what I'm talking about and what you're supposed to be talking about in this video, because that's what this guy is referring to in his video, is player skill. The requirements of player skill. And the requirements of player skill for DPS in World of Warcraft is way lower. Way lower. They're at the bottom. They're at the bottom. They require the least amount of player skill in order to succeed at. Then would be healers. Then would be tanks at the top. Okay? I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. And if you disagree, well, it's a free country. You can be wrong all you want. But them's the breaks. Okay? DPS, just especially at the range DPS, I would say melee DPS is harder than range DPS. Range DPS is at the bottom, the very bottom of the bucket. If you want something that you can be half asleep and then just freaking hit like 1 or 2 buttons and be good, range DPS is where you go. That's where you go. You just sit there in a corner, flinging your little arrows, half asleep, or flinging your frost bolts, half asleep, and you're good to go. Every now and then weave in a fire blast. Woo! Man, the skill is crazy. It's like very few fights actually require them to do a whole lot. You got Onyxia with the whelps. Get them whelps. Yeah, okay. We got a mage and a warlock on each side, and they just destroy them. No problem. It's easy. And then everybody else is just waiting on the tank to pick up Onyxia, and then they just walk up to the side of her, and then start hitting their little buttons, and they just stand there, good to go. They don't have to worry about boss positioning or nothing. Tank's got to worry about that. And the tank's got to do what? Stance dance every other fear? Because I'm pretty sure Onyxia's fear was every 15 seconds, right? So every other fear, they got to stance dance it. What, Magmadar, we had to stance dance it. We had to change our stances, hit Berserker Rage, change back. And originally we didn't have any kind of add-ons, right? At the beginning. And then we started getting add-ons. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh man, 30 seconds. And then freaking another fear. Oh, it's fear in 5 seconds. And then you're like, oh, well, I'll just stance dance in. But originally, guess what? When we were first fighting Magmadar, you know what I was doing? I was counting it in my head. I was counting down 30 1,000, 29 1,000, 30, all the way down to 5. And then I would stance dance. And then I would start mentally counting again while I'm doing everything else that I'm doing as a main tank. Okay? And you're telling me that the damage had to worry about that crap? No, they didn't. They just ate the fear. Because that's what everybody else had to do. Only the warriors could stance dance it. There's so many fights that require technical skill from the main tank. And if they fuck it up, everyone dies. And you cannot say the same for DPS. You can somewhat say the same for healers, but it's not to the same degree. You can lose a healer and be okay. Depends on the fight, depends on the gear of your healers. How many healers do you have? Are you a healer heavy raid? If you're healer heavy, then you can probably lose 1 or 2 healers and be fine. Especially if it's towards the end of the fight, right? But you can't say the same thing for the tank. The main tank goes down, you're done most of the time. Like 90% of the time. It depends on what kind of off tank you got. If that off tank is worth his salt, he's got some good gear on him. You put some decent gear on that off tank so that they can still hold their own. Then okay, maybe that off tank can pick it up. Stop your DPS for like 5 seconds here. Let them build some threat up. And then freaking resume your fight. And you're fine. You just recover. But that's so rare that happens. Usually the main tank dies and immediately like 2 or 3 melee DPS dies in 1 shot apiece. That's how it goes. So, I don't know what you're talking about.
Understand the dungeon. In terms of expectations, tanking is the easiest role.
And it's one of the reasons it's so easy to find a tank. No one wants to do it, so every party is looking for one.
Yeah.
For example, if you queue up as a DPS, you're probably going to take 15 to 20 minutes to match up with other players.
Yeah.
But if you queue up as a tank, it'll usually take less than 3 minutes before an open slot is found. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is, unless you're playing with friends, you're going to run into some toxic players through matchmaking. And this isn't just in MMOs. In fact, it's easy to argue that tanks are even more unpopular in PvP games. Because If we return one more time to Wikipedia, the final 6 words are the nail in the coffin, while sacrificing their own damage output. And that's the kicker. While the tank is meant to be...
What the fuck ever, man. Like, dude, Zarya is OP as fuck in Overwatch. Like, I did tons of damage to Reinhardt. What do you mean? Bro, like, whenever you play tank, you can do so much fucking damage in Overwatch.
more than just a meat.
Okay, this is a guy that doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, you can do tons of damage as tanks in Overwatch. That's the problem. That was the problem. That was like the beginning of the end. If you really look at the rise and fall of Overwatch, then you're going to see that it peaked up at around about the time that tank meta was happening, that this guy's going to talk about, and then it was all downhill from there. It was all downhill. That started the downhill right there. Everybody playing nothing but tanks and then healers and no DPS, so that nobody had properly balanced teams. They didn't even need DPS. So using that as an example is terrible. You're using the game that is the shining example of why that's bad to have tanks dealing tons of damage as, what do you mean? What do you mean, man? I did tons of damage, blah, blah, blah. No, a better one, though, I'll just throw you a bone here. A better one is League of Legends. Because there's so many freaking champions in that game. And there's a lot of tanks that can do some real damage, especially if you build them wrong on purpose. AKA, rabbit ears wrong here, But, AKA wrong, you take freaking Jarvan 4, who's a tank, and then you build him pure freaking attack damage, and then he starts deleting any squishy in the game. He just jumps on you with his ult, and then you just disappear. It's ridiculous. But in Overwatch, there's no builds, there's no items. So that's just how the champion is how they are. And they overtuned the tanks because they don't understand the freaking Holy Trinity. They didn't understand numbers, apparently. And they screwed their game up. And then people started leaving it in droves. Not long after. Imagine that. Who could have thought that when you completely destroy the Holy Trinity because you don't understand math, then players stop playing your game because it's dumb. Mind blown here. Mind blown.
Shield in a game like Overwatch, tasked with controlling space, dictating engagements, and peeling for wounded teammates, they trade their defense for offense. No matter how cool or well-designed a tank character is, the average player will find it boring if they can't kill anything. So how can developers fix this?
I'm gonna be honest, I think tank is the most fun role to play in Overwatch.
Well, it's not as simple as just giving tanks more offensive capabilities. The line between
So you think that the most overtuned class in the game is the most fun to play? Why am I not shocked? Why am I not surprised? Imagine that. He just wants to play the easiest thing that lets him win the most, and then that's the most fun. He has no interest in game balance whatsoever. None at all. He doesn't want to have to struggle to beat the enemy team. He doesn't want a challenge. He just wants it handed to him. Somebody in their early 30s that just want things handed to them that they don't want to work for. I've never heard of such a thing. That's the first I've ever heard of that happening. That's new.
Glorified meat shield and unkillable death machine is a razor's edge. And when the tuning is just a tiny bit
that, bro? See that? Look at watch.
off,
Literally,
the Holy Trinity gets thrown into chaos. After all,
why didn't it kill him in one hit?
if tanks can DPS as well as the DPS, why DPS? For
Yeah.
Overwatch 1, this issue resulted in GOATs. For more than a year, basically every professional team
was
running
Ramtrada. I didn't even realize. I thought it was Genji.
3 tanks and 3 supports, with every DPS character other than Sombra becoming useless. The reason?
I hated
Tanks
that
could deal
character.
just as much, if not more damage,
That's right.
all the while having the added benefit of being
More
a
health.
walking refrigerator.
Yeah.
The problem was so bad that they couldn't just change the characters, they had to change the way the game was played. First was the role lock, which ensured 2 DPS, 2 healers, and 2 tanks per team.
Yep.
And then in Overwatch 2, they fully transitioned to a 5v5 format so that teams couldn't have 2 tanks. Plus, tanks in PvP games share a lot of the same issues as their PvE counterparts.
I think the problem is, like, I'm talking about at WoW in specific. I hate tanks in PvP and WoW. I absolutely fucking hate them. The only time that I think you should be able to play tank in PvP is if there's a flag that you need to hold on to. Like, I think that you should literally not be allowed to queue tank into arena. It should just be grayed out. You can't do it. No prop paladins, no guardian druids, no blood DKs, no prop warriors. It should never fucking exist. It is never fun to fight against a tank. Now, I'll tell you this, though. In another game like Overwatch, or I remember I played Heroes of the Storm back in the day, like, tanking was pretty much fine. But holy fuck did I hate playing tanks against WoW, playing against tanks in WoW. It was awful.
Similarly, in League.
Yeah, I bet you don't, because they're hard to kill. But the thing is, I did PvP as a tank in World of Warcraft. I actually made a stun lock PvP protection build back in the day. Worked really well until I started climbing. And, at some point, once I started climbing, I reached a cap and I couldn't go any further because that's as viable as it was at the time. The reason why he doesn't like it is because he can't just target that dude and zerk him down, and they're just constantly irritating the whole time. But in reality, him complaining about tanks in PvP just reminds me of the Call of Duty players constantly complaining about campers. It's a freaking strategy, dude. So check your corners. Stop running around like a madman, shooting, randomly all these people and not checking your freaking corners. Check your corners. It's just basic knowledge to check your corners. As you pass through doorways, you check your corners. So you don't want to do that, and then you get blasted in the back by somebody with a shotgun that was sitting there. That's part of the game. Shut the fuck up. It's a legitimate strategy. So figure out a way to get it. Put your brain to use. Figure out a way to get around it and deal with it. Or, I don't know, keep dying to it, I guess. Fuck. Not like I care.
League of Legends, tank champions like Ornn and Maokai seem to flip-flop from being insanely overtuned, simultaneously tanking and dealing the most damage on their team, to being nearly useless, no matter how fed they become. On top of this, tanks in League have to engage fights and peel for DPSs, and if they don't perform perfectly...
Okay, so just as a note on what he's showing, some of these, not all tanks in League of Legends are created equally. Like the tank he was just showing in mid lane is Rel. Well, she's not meant to do a lot of damage. If she did a lot of damage, she would be so overpowered because she's so tanky and hard to kill. Most of your tanks that are extremely hard to kill, like on the extreme side, they don't do a lot of damage. They're not very damage heavy. And if you build them so that they do good damage, then now they're not as tanky. Like Jarvan 4, okay, well, you can make him AD if you want to, and he will melt your back line. Don't let him get into your back line. Ward on both sides of you. You can see him trying to flank, and then turn and burn him down because he ain't very tanky. He can barely do anything as far as damage absorption. And then there's other tanks that are kind of middle of the road. They're pretty tanky, but they also do a pretty good amount of damage if you're building them correctly. So, some of these aren't the most fair comparisons in the world. And to be fair, it's not the easiest thing in the world to make a good comparison when you're talking about League of Legends that has like 160 something champions. Of course, you're going to have people that are all over the board. And then you also have different ways to build. You can build AD, you can build AP, you can build tank, and you can build support. And then you can mix those items together. You don't have to build one of the 4 ways. You can mix those all together and come out with different builds. It's some of the magic that is League of Legends that makes it so much fun. So, just saying though.
They're gonna get flamed.
Well, and that's the other thing, right? Is like the tank needs to be aware of the tank needs the highest level of knowledge because they...
Oh, the highest level of knowledge. Here we go. All right, Asmon, you just tell us how much more skill the tanks need, and then turn around and tell us that the tanks don't need very much skill. It makes perfect sense. Let's see what you have to say about how much skill we need, and then I'm sure you'll turn around and say, well, but they don't need skill though.
They do initiate encounters. So like whenever the tank makes a play, like an Overwatch or something like that, the tank has to make that play because they know what everything is happening. They know everything that's happening. Ever see Wait Raid? Wait, I got a raid? Start watching. What's this? Oh, it's her? Oh shit. Yo, what up, boys? Hey. Hey guys. How you doing? Yeah, hi guys. Yeah. Yeah, hi. Hi. Hope you're having fun. This is a little bit different than what you saw before. Yeah. But it's still good.
Games that truly succeed in implementing tanks are the ones that don't pigeonhole themselves with the traditional Holy Trinity. Take the Heavy in Team Fortress 2, for example. He has the most health in the game, but he also has the slowest speed in the game. He has a 50% reduction in knockback, but is a sitting duck for snipers. He can dish out a decent amount of damage, but easily gets outmaneuvered by scouts. Because TF2 doesn't have a set DPS, healer, and tank role, the Heavy isn't a mandatory character to have in your comp. But when you do include him, he's balanced and synergizes well with the medic, as God intended. For most games, however, the tank role remains unbalanced. Whether it's tanking for a raid group in World of War,
I think that Lost Ark has tanking very well designed. I think that a gun lancer tank in Lost Ark is probably the best implementation of a tank that we've seen.
Warcraft, defending the point as a tank in Overwatch, or being the frontline tank in any multiplayer game in general, tanks are a tough role to get into. While it can feel incredibly satisfying in a pre-made group where everything gels and goes smoothly, it's typically a gamble every time you're solo queuing, and the experience can quickly go from bad to terrible. With all the stress associated with the role, tank players truly are unsung heroes. The game knowledge and patience—
No, they're not. Let's just stop this right now. I play tank all the time. Tanking is not an unsung hero job. It's literally just being able to do the same thing that everybody else is doing, but knowing it slightly better. You have the lowest expectations of anybody in the group. So basically, if you're going to have like what—
Okay, so we have to. He just admitted, right? He just admitted that we as tanks need to have more knowledge than everyone else. It sounds like skill to me. It sounds like skill to me, right? Is that not skill? And then the lowest expectations. The lowest expectations, like, not dying. Because if we die, then everybody else dies. But we have low expectations, right? While the boss is pounding us in the face. It makes no sense.
What is the hardest role? DPS is the hardest role. Because you are always being graded against the best players in the game. Whereas like healing is binary, tanking is generally binary. And let me explain why. Healers, all you have to do is make sure that other people don't die. If you do that, you're a good healer. Tanking, all you have to do is make sure that you don't die and you hold aggro. If you do that, you're a good tank. But DPS are always graded against the highest and best player that did whatever fight that they're doing. So because of that, DPS will always be viewed not really as comparatively good or bad as they really are. Does that make—
No, it doesn't make sense. Thanks for asking. Who the hell is going to be running a random dungeon and then compare the DPS in that dungeon that they're running that's probably, not a top level dungeon to somebody that's the best in the game? That doesn't make any sense. What you're talking about only holds water when you're putting it in the context of mythic level raids, like top level raids. And then those guys are the highly competitive ones. But most people aren't that. So you can't make these generalized statements that only applies to like 1% of the player base and then say it applies to everyone. No, it doesn't. Like if you're freaking running a regular dungeon with a pickup group, then as long as the guys are dying in the proper time frame, who cares what the DPS is? Nobody's bothering with that crap. Nobody cares, man. Nobody cares. And if you're running in a lower level guild, maybe they're not mythic level guild, okay, cool. they're just going to look at whether they're able to take the fight down and then try to figure out, well, is the problem the DPS? Do we not have enough DPS? How do we get more DPS? Is the problem the healers? Is the problem the tank and he doesn't have enough gear? Or if he's using his rotations wrong? You're just going to try to figure out what the issue is. You're going to solve it. You're not going to sit there and berate people just because they're not at the highest level of DPS compared to some other person. That's absurd. And again, this isn't player skill that you're talking about. It's a matter of what gear that DPS has as to how much damage they could potentially put out, and then their rotations, if they're going through their rotations correctly. And that'll also determine how much DPS they put out. But at the end of the day, if their rotations are good, then it's just a matter of, oh, well, you just don't have enough gear to put out the damage that we need. Like, big deal. That's not the biggest deal in the world. And to say that that takes skill is absurd. No, it doesn't. It takes a time investment in order to get the gear that you need. Or maybe a time investment to learn from someone else, to look up some guides, because we have those now, in order to figure out what you're doing wrong in your rotations. And then you fix it. That's it. That doesn't take skill. That takes mouse clicks and some keyboard typing. That's it. Freaking tanks require actual skill to play and be good at. Easy to play, hard to master. Yeah. But freaking damage is just plain easy. As long as you're talking about PvE. PvP is different. But PvE is just hitting buttons, man. That's it.
Makes sense? Fucking read chat? No, why would I read chat? I know what I'm talking about. I played the game 15 years. I know this better than everybody else.
Yeah, 15 years, and you're saying shit that's this dumb. You don't want to read chat because some of them actually know what they're talking about. Not all of them, probably not most of them, but some of them do. And you don't want to be contradicted. You think you're so good, that's fine. At the end of this video, I'll have a little test for you, and we'll see how good you are. Since you know everything about tanking, we'll see if you answer the questions correctly. Yeah, we'll find out. It's fine.
Yeah, explain gunline strat. Yeah, that's just the way it is. Bro, never played a healer? No. Healing can be really hard, but healing is only as hard as the other people in the group make it. So, like, healing, the difficulty of healing is always, like, variable based off of if you have a good group or not. Because you guys have seen a lot of these, like, like mythic, like really, really good Mythic Plus runs or like challenge mode runs back in the day. Healers usually didn't even do anything. They're just sitting there doing damage the whole time. And they're just doing like incidental healing through the damage. Because they don't need to be spamming heals because everybody else in the group is really good. But the difference is that healing can be really hard, absolutely. But DPS is always going to be hard because you're required to play at a level that is like extremely high because you're always being graded against other DPS. And DPS can always be higher, but healing can't always be higher. This is correct. Healers in chat are molding? Yeah.
Yeah, like I said before, if you have a well-oiled group, which is what you're talking about, by the time you get to Mythic Plus, whatever, that's going to be a well-oiled group. These people have done this many times. They know exactly what they're doing. And yeah, it makes it way easier on the healer. And at that point, you're not going to be able to really tell a whole lot whether that healer is a high-skill healer. But, he got there somehow, right? He's at the point he's at in the game somehow. And usually the terrible players, they're not going to be there, right? They haven't made it there. How you know if you have a good healer is when things go wrong and the healer holds it together. The healer is keeping the main tank alive and then keeping other people that are messing up alive, covering their mistakes, and he's still keeping the main tank up. That's a good healer. But you got a well-oiled group that knows exactly how to do the fight already. They've already got it down pat, like these guys speed running Dark Souls. Okay, you're probably not going to be able to tell very well that healer actually has a ton of skill. He's really good, because he's just sitting there just doing his thing, going through the routine that he's done 1,000 times before. So, yeah, I mean, you're right, and you're also wrong at the same time.
The role demands, and the thick skin you need, in addition to your thick armor, makes it a hard but rewarding role to...
Well, one thing we can agree on, right, is we're arguing in chat whether healing or tanking is hard. Or sorry, whether healing or DPS is harder. Nobody's arguing whether tanking is harder, okay? My point is that tanking is the easiest job in the game.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not even the easiest job in League of Legends, which is what's on the screen right now, because the tank is the one that initiates. But he can't, if he initiates at the wrong time, then everybody dies. Even if they follow up, everybody dies. And every one of those other players has to go with him in order to have the best chance of success. Otherwise, they could leave the tank to die. And now they're defending under the turret 5v4 in the late game because these guys are 16, 17, 16, 15. That's not good. That's not good. So if that tank initiated and everybody else just ran off, well, they get a free Baron. Well, you don't want that to happen. You know what I'm saying? So you have to fight it out. And it's a risk no matter what. But if the tank initiates at the wrong time, everybody would die most of the time. It's not going to work out very good. That means that tank needs to know exactly the situation of the team. Who's stronger, how the champions scale, who's got the advantage. Did somebody step out of line and you can pick them or whatever? Everybody else just waits on the tank to make the call. And that's a difficult call to make in League of Legends a lot of times. That's not easy, and then should you switch targets during the fight when it's going on? Why? When? These are important questions to be answering, and the tank needs to have the answer.
Play. So the next time you see a tank player in your game, show them some appreciation, and if they do mess up, just remember, it's hard work, but someone's gotta do it. This video is made possible thanks to our wonderful patrons. Massive thank you to everyone on this
more
list,
tanking
and shout out to
propaganda.
B, Pass, Shampoo, and
More
Yashichi
tanking
for being
propaganda,
platinum
guys.
supporters, as well as an extra special shout out to Cloud, Steph.
Tanking propaganda. Spoken by someone who has no idea what they're talking about. And I'm about to prove it. So I've got 2 questions for you. First question. What's most important for a warrior tank? Block, dodge, or parry? And you can pause this video and think about it if you want to. And I'll give you the answer. Most important is parry. Then would be block. Then would be dodge. So, next question. Is it good to have 50% dodge as a main tank? Again, you can pause the video and think about it. I'll tell you the answer. The answer is no, it's not good. It's good for a rogue. It's not good for a main tank. So here's why. So here's 50%. This is 50%. Let's say we got 50% dodge. So here's hit, miss, hit, miss, hit, miss, hit, miss, hit, miss. This is easy to heal. And then we go all the way down to 5 hits in a row, 5 misses in a row. That is hard to heal. And a lot of times your tank will die if that happens. And it's still 50%. Granted, it's a small sample size, but still 50%. 50% is 50%. And RNG states that any one of these scenarios could play out. All of them are just as likely to play out as each other. That's percentages that you say people don't understand. Well, I hope you can understand this. Because the tank that gets hit 5 times in a row and those healers aren't expecting it, and that tank doesn't use something to save their ass, that's a dead tank. So that's why you don't want 50% dodge, right? Now, the reason parry is the most important stat is because not only does it completely negate the damage, but you get rage back. And the reason I put block over dodge is because dodge doesn't give you anything back. No rage. You just completely negate the damage. Do you want some dodge? Of course you do. But I would actually more prioritize block over dodge because block absorbs some of the hit. I think it's something like 15% or something like that. But if you can keep spamming block, then that keeps the hits, the damage consistent on your character, and you get rage back. But you're still reducing the amount of damage that you're taking. So I usually shot for something like 30, 35% dodge. I'd go for like 40% parry, and then whatever I could get into block. over that. That's how I worked it. You know, if I could get 35% or 40% block, that was awesome. 40 and 40 with block and parry, and then 30% dodge, you're doing really good here. Doing really good. And if you missed any of those freaking answers, I'm sorry. Granted, you know, block and dodge are arguable. Which one's more important? But there is no arguing the fact that parry is more important than dodge. And anybody who tries to get 50% dodge on their main tank character is an idiot because they're going to die. And I had some people try that. And I was like, you know, I explained this whole thing to them. I'm like, you know what? Agree to disagree. You know what we'll do? We'll take your 50% dodge. You can main tank this boss. That's no problem. You know, and I'd explain it to my guild what's going on. Oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Cost us 5 minutes. And guess what? That dude died. Every time he died. And then finally, we're like, all right, that's enough testing, dude. If you don't want to believe him, that's fine, but we got to continue this raid. And we continued. I took over. I didn't die. You know, the proof is in the pudding, as they say. Anyways, yeah, I didn't plan on doing this video, but the stuff that Asmon is saying is, I'm sorry, it's some of the dumbest crap I've ever freaking heard him say. He does not know what in the world he's talking about. That dude needed to play more World of Warcraft back in the original days, you know, in vanilla, in order to speak to this subject. So, all right, I'll see you in the next one.